The story begins in a very obscure setting. The male lead is embracing Jeanella, laying her on the bed with a dark and enticing expression, calling out Jeanella's name. Then, the male lead buries his face in the female lead's chest, using a seductive and intimate tone. He addresses her as "my Jeanella," and at this moment, the female lead becomes hesitant, clutching her clothes nervously, her voice hesitant as she says, wait. However, before the male lead can proceed further, he is forcefully pushed away by strong hands. Not only does Jeanella push him away, but she also appears fiercely angry, directly calling him by his name, Ted Bundy. Despite the forceful rejection, Ted Bundy remains unperturbed and instead, exceedingly indulgent, responding to her, "Yes, Jeanella." Despite Ted's tenderness towards her, Jeanella still maintains an angry expression, questioning whether it was him who ordered the execution of the noble's daughter. In response to Jeanella's angry question, Ted Bundy seems unfazed, gently taking Jeanella's hand, treating it like a precious item, tenderly kissing her hand and asking, "Was it wrong of me to do so?" Confused by Ted Bundy's words and actions, Jeanella is unable to articulate her thoughts coherently. Ted Bundy continues to be gentle and affectionate, holding her hand and professing his love for her. Jeanella is left speechless, unsure of how to react to his declarations of affection. Suddenly, the female lead is pushed onto the bed by him. Shocked and motionless, she forgets to resist and can only lie still, staring into Ted Bundy's captivating and deep eyes. His mesmerizing voice instructs her, "You are only allowed to look at me." All of Ted Bundy's actions leave the female lead in turmoil, questioning herself about what she might have done wrong. The scene then shifts to the female lead's mind, envisioning a hospital scene with blood splattered across the floor. Doctors rush around, attending to a critically injured patient who is losing a lot of blood, preparing for a blood transfusion and rushing them into the operating room. A mother collapses, holding her bloodied daughter's hands, tears streaming down her face, pleading, "Doctor, please save my daughter." In response, the female lead can only try to suppress her own pain and respond to her mother, "I'm sorry, Mom. I have to go first." As she speaks these words, her mother's face darkens, crying out loudly, begging her not to close her eyes, to stay awake and look at her. After a series of agonizing cries in her mind, the female lead finally jolts awake, her entire body drenched in sweat, trembling with fear, murmuring heaven and earth. Her mind is filled with 1,000 thoughts after experiencing that terrifying dream. Jeanella is so frightened that she hurriedly places her hand on her chest to calm herself down, her face pale and terrified. Jeanella's younger sister, Garnet, sitting beside her, immediately expressed concern, asking her elder sister, "Hey, what's wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" Garnet leaned closer as she asked, seeming afraid that Jeanella wouldn't want to respond. Across from them, Jeanella's mother, the Duchess Claire, along with her father, Duke Milan Han, also looked tense upon seeing their daughter's unease. Her mother exclaimed in alarm, calling Jeanella by her intimate name, as if confirming whether she was truly okay. Meanwhile, her father fretted, shouting, "What's wrong? Stop the car immediately." Faced with such overwhelming concern from her family, the female lead could only pretend. Suddenly, finding an excuse to evade, she turned her head to look outside, then gently replied, "It's nothing, just feeling a bit strange returning to the capital after 14 years away." Upon hearing her sister's response, Garnet sympathetically asked, "Sister, are you very stressed?" Their parents chuckled happily, affectionately saying, "No matter how grown-up you become, Jeanella, you will always be our adorable daughter, won't you?" The family continued to laugh and chat until the wheels stopped turning, and the car halted at the mansion's entrance. Jeanella's father announced gently, "We have arrived at the mansion." After his announcement, Jeanella also felt a surge of unnamed emotions, gently stepping out of the car, her mind swirling with thoughts of her homeland after 14 years, which seemed unchanged. Her heart was also filled with waves of memories of the strange events that had happened to her. Jeanella Han had transmigrated into this body for 20 years now. As she walked into the mansion with her family, her mind was still filled with thoughts about her current life. This was surely a common plot after being robbed of life in her previous existence. When I opened my eyes, I was in a different world. For some, this chance to live again might be an opportunity to showcase themselves, but it wasn't for me. I hadn't read any romance novels, nor had I played any games before the changes in my life over the past 10 or so years. Jeanella still held a belief that everything was just a dream. The family I was born into was considered one of the founding noble families, the courtiers of the Northern Empire. The Han family and I, with my beloved family, Jeanella thought to herself, then glanced at her younger sister Garnet in front of her, who was eagerly asking their mother, "Is this really our home, Mom? Why is it so huge?" At her younger sister's excitement, their mother could only chuckle and say, "Garnet was born after our family was filled to the brim, wasn't she?" "This is also the first time I've seen the mansion," Jeanella said. "Yes, it's quite different from Ven," she added, her eyes sparkling with happiness as she looked at her mother and sister. But then, a guilty and hesitant expression appeared on her face as she said to both of them, "I'm really sorry that everyone had to experience being filled to the brim because of me." Before she could dwell on her self-blame for long, the whole family rushed over to hug her affectionately. Her mother couldn't help but scold her lovingly, saying, "I told you not to say that." Yes, I also like Ven very much, everyone, no one is to blame." Jeanella pushed her parents towards the mansion and patted them. "I know, so I'll go now." Being pushed away like that, her parents could only smile kindly, while she alone seemed excessively cold. After the whole family happily entered the house together, only the female lead remained standing from a distance, watching their every joyful step. She pondered, how could I bear to hate those who love me so much? However, no matter how much love and care she received, Jeanella understood that this place was not hers, or frankly speaking, it wasn't meant for her. This thought saddened her. Jeanella gathered her courage and called out to her parents. Her parents perked up, their faces filled with anticipation, wanting to know what she wanted to say. Jeanella had silently resolved, "I have something I need to do." So she put on the calmest and happiest expression, telling her parents, "I want to transfer to the Siam Research Institute." The Siam Research Institute is known as a national institution specializing in magical power research. It even establishes and operates an academy for nobles, and is a long-standing historical monument in this world. Besides humans, there are also the existence of fairies and deities. Therefore, studying magic will be a crucial key for humans to understand more deeply and find a way back to the original era. As she thought about this, Jeanella also held the admission notice in her hand, feeling a bit surprised and also a bit lucky. She thought to herself, "I never thought I would be admitted like this." Indeed, she had participated in the Academy's entrance exam, but she found it a bit strange when she remembered the day she went there to apply for admission. When she had just greeted the admissions officer and said to him, "I'm here to submit my application," he immediately became extremely shocked and exclaimed to her, "Aren't you the Miss Han?" So in this moment, seeing the red seal on the confirmation paper, Jeanella still felt extremely puzzled. She whispered to herself, "It's as if they already knew I would come here." However, she didn't dwell on it too much, just took a deep breath. Then, her face was full of joy again. She reminded herself, well, just the thought of being able to study magic is already great. But just on her first day of school, Jeanella encountered her first trouble. Someone had seen her and sneered, "Oh, isn't that Miss Seo Han?" This person was a blonde girl who seemed arrogant. Following her were two others who looked like her followers. Once the sarcastic remark from the blonde was heard, everyone nearby started gossiping about the female lead. They seemed unrestrained, speaking loudly, "If she's from the Han family, wasn't that family stripped of their title under grandfather Huang's reign? Shoo! It really is Miss Han." Hearing the gossip, Jeanella remained unmoved, unconcerned, until she heard someone reminding their companion, "Be careful with your words about her, Prince. No, the Emperor might hear." At this point, Jeanella was slightly startled, thinking about these two words, Prince. She suddenly seemed to be reminded of some memories, silently thinking, remembering now. It seems that Wet Blanket has ascended the throne. Jeanella couldn't help but smile unconsciously. Then, she reminded herself, those things are in the past now. Unexpectedly, the disappointment seemed to anger the blonde girl to the point where she shouted angrily, "Is she ignoring me now?" She pointed at herself and shouted at Jeanella, "Are you the miss of the Han family?" Indeed, a girl who doesn't know how to behave. Facing this rudeness from the blonde girl, Jeanella still didn't react, just silently wondering if this girl was a daughter of a count, while the blonde girl was still glaring at her, ordering Jeanella to answer. Looking at the attitude of the blonde girl, it reminded Jeanella that during the time when her family, the founding lineage of the empire, was exiled to the border, the power of the dukes had significantly weakened, and of course, the noble families had seized that opportunity to rise stronger. Thinking about this, Jeanella wasn't worried at all. Instead, she became even more determined in her silent thoughts. I don't care about these petty power struggles, nor do I need to be afraid or compromise with those who openly show hostility towards me. With this in mind, Jeanella burst into laughter, but this laughter only made Lily angrier. "Why are you laughing?" Lily couldn't believe that Jeanella not only mocked her but also displayed her noble demeanor, questioning whether she truly was an aristocrat. Casually calling out someone's name, "Your family didn't teach you the basic etiquette of communication?" Jeanella's words were light but full of sarcasm, making Lily grit her teeth in frustration, her voice trembling as she shouted, "What?" Then, Lily became even more furious, clenching her fists and shouting, "I dare you. I dare say that I'm very close to the emperor since he was a prince. As for the downfall of your Han family," but before she could finish her sentence, she fell silent because of a soft laughter that interrupted her, striking Lily's eyes. It was the mysterious emperor whom she had just boasted about being close to, standing behind Jeanella. This laughter and figure froze Jeanella in place, still trying to understand what was happening, while Lily was so scared that she fell silent, her face shocked, her eyes wide with fear at the words she had just spoken. At this moment, the emperor seemed extremely angry, speaking calmly, "I have certainly ordered the restoration of the title and returned the territory to the Han family. Yet, there are still those who dare to disregard my orders?" Right after the emperor spoke, everyone present there looked terrified, their faces pale, immediately bowing and echoing loudly, "Greetings to the emperor," in a fearful tone. The emperor continued, coldly ordering Jeanella to be taken away and executed. Even Jeanella, amidst the murmurs and gasps around him, was momentarily stunned. She hesitated, wondering, I heard Ted had ascended the throne already? Then she looked straight at the person referred to as the emperor before her, silently speculating with a sense of dread, so who is this person? Suddenly, Jeanella remembered a book she had read. There are many worlds existing in this life, each world far apart, so most worlds are unaware of each other's existence. But occasionally, there are those who cross from one world to another. Jeanella read up to this point, then closed the book with a rather grim expression. After rummaging through all the books and finding nothing, she sighed in frustration, thinking, this book is useless. After a futile search, she leaned against a tree trunk, sighing deeply and lamenting, this world is not interesting at all. Just show me how to move to another world. At this moment, when the female lead was deeply troubled, the little prince approached. He seemed to be in a hurry to find Jeanella, because before he even reached her, he hastily called out her name, Jeanella. This call caught her attention, and she looked over. The prince, with his shiny golden hair and an extremely cute face, called out, I'm here, Jeanella, I missed you so much. With a deeply affectionate look in his eyes, the prince stepped closer to Jeanella. However, Jeanella seemed distant and cold, holding up a book, pretending to be busy, and curtly greeted the prince with a few words, Hello, Your Highness. The little prince felt sorry after hearing Jeanella's greeting and said to her, There's no one around here. Call me by my name. Then, blushing, the little prince took out a blooming flower, offered it to Jeanella with a bright smile, and said gently, Today, let's get married. If so, we can be together every day. But as the prince spoke, Jeanella seemed to have no more patience. She sighed and interrupted him by calling out, Ted, as if to stop him from talking further. Then, she became even colder, telling the prince, I've already said, you're not my ideal. However, despite Jeanella's cold rejection, the crown prince refused to give up. He asked, what is Jeanella's ideal? At that moment, faced with the prince's pleading gaze, Jeanella still insisted, telling him, my ideal? She remembered the scene from that day, then returned to reality, looking straight at the man with black hair and black eyes in front of her. Her heart seemed filled with question marks. Unable to contain her confusion, she thought to herself, clearly, I heard that Ted had ascended the throne already. Jeanella remembered that she had heard that the crown prince of the Northern Empire, Ted Bundy Viller, was her childhood friend. He often fell ill and cried after her every day. So, even though he hadn't contacted her in 14 years, she thought there must be some reason for it. She genuinely congratulated him upon hearing the news of his ascension to the throne. But the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. Staring intently at the mysterious and cold man everyone called the Emperor before her, Jeanella couldn't understand this cold-blooded person. Who is he, after all? At this moment, even the headmaster had arrived. Despite being older, when he saw the person in front of him, the headmaster still had to respectfully call out, Your Majesty. The headmaster knelt down and begged for mercy on behalf of Lily, the blonde girl. He pleaded with the Emperor, saying that this student was still naive, so she made a mistake. Could Your Majesty please forgive her just this once? Meanwhile, Lily, the blonde girl, was so scared that as soon as she saw the old man, she started crying and pleading for mercy incessantly. The headmaster tried to persuade the Emperor further, saying, moreover, she is the daughter of Count Sunny. But the Emperor remained unmoved, even reproaching, the first Emperor took everything from the innocent Han family, so I returned everything to them. Hearing the Emperor's words, Lily seemed even more resentful, crying and trying to control herself, saying, I didn't. Meanwhile, the Emperor still maintained a cold and aloof demeanor. He looked down at her like a judge, interrogating her, How dare you act like this? Just because you're a Sunni? Looking at this scene, Jeanella couldn't believe her eyes. She stood there, mouth agape, thinking, he looks somewhat like Ted. But can someone's personality change so much after 14 years? Moreover, the black hair and eyes seem unreasonable. Jeanella looked at the Emperor, seemingly all her thoughts scrambled. She had no way of knowing if this person was the boy Ted in her memory. Because blonde hair and gray eyes are the symbols of royal unity, but the appearance of the man before her did not match. Indeed, it was strange, and Jeanella's heart trembled with fear. After swallowing all those thoughts, Jeanella gathered her courage and softly called out, Your Majesty. She bowed respectfully to the Emperor before her and gently pleaded with him, Please forgive Miss Sunni. Although she committed a serious crime, death is not warranted. If Your Majesty pardons her, everyone will respect you more. Jeanella still maintained her bowed posture, and her attitude and demeanor seemed to momentarily stagger the Emperor. He seemed somewhat at a loss for words. Meanwhile, Jeanella, still not having received permission to rise from the Emperor, maintained her bowed position, silently betting in her heart. If that man is indeed the wet-nosed Ted from back then he will comply with my request, or perhaps he has forgotten who I am. After all, it has been 14 years. After contemplating, she introduced herself, I am Jeanella, of the Han family. However, just as he mentioned that, the Emperor suddenly placed his hand on her shoulder, and in an extremely calm tone, he said, Princess, you are truly generous. He lowered his head to face her directly, then in a very gentle and mocking tone, he said, begging forgiveness for insulting your own family? Isn't that quite commendable? The Emperor? As soon as he finished speaking, the principal on the other side hurriedly chimed in, Yes, exactly. Meanwhile, Jeanella stood still, recalling the Emperor's expression just now, her heart even more tense. This man must be Ted. After hearing Jeanella's plea from her own mouth, the Emperor, although still cold, ordered our soldiers not to kill Lily anymore, but to imprison her under the palace dungeon. After giving the order, he turned to continue, And I also want to visit the academy, Princess, can you lead me there? He gently asked Jeanella, then politely extended his hand to her. Ginella, although frowning, still placed her hand on the emperor's hand, then gently replied, yes, of course. She became even more worried, silently thinking, how much has he changed in appearance? Ginella respectfully led the emperor around the academy. Throughout the journey, Ginella diligently guided and introduced everything to the emperor, pointing out the promenade and other paths. However, the prince remained silent, not saying a word. His attitude made Ginella extremely anxious. As they walked, she worriedly thought, even when I lead him to the forest path, he still won't say a word. She speculated that if it was a magical change in appearance, she wouldn't feel its magic. But in this world, there were no dyes or contact lenses, right? Can humans change like that? Or is there some magic that she doesn't know about? Ginella absent-mindedly brought her hand to her mouth, seemingly biting her nails, a habit she had whenever she was worried. While Ginella was immersed in her anxious thoughts, the emperor suddenly called her name. Initially, he seemed hesitant, as if he hadn't called her name for a long time. Then, when he caught on, he directly pulled her into a strong embrace, softly calling Ginella's name. This action surprised Ginella. She just stood there wide-eyed as he buried his head in her shoulder. Then, with a trembling voice, she called him Your Majesty. Unexpectedly, upon hearing this call, the emperor became even sadder. He gently buried his face in her shoulder, apologizing softly, I'm sorry. He maintained the embrace from behind, his head buried in the hollow of her shoulder. Full of self-blame, he continued, because I was late, you got angry, right? That's why you distanced yourself, called me Your Majesty, and bowed to me. I'm sorry. Please forgive me, he said, seemingly more emotional, tears streaming down his face. Ginella felt the tears on her shoulder. She gently touched his face as if comforting him. She lifted his tear-stained face to hers, then, with a heart full of pain, she called his name, Ted. Meanwhile, the emperor, still teary-eyed, sniffing, took hold of her hands on his face, and with great sadness, said, I thought you had forgotten about me. Ginella still kept her hands on his face, her heart filled with sorrow, silently thinking that there were so many things she wanted to ask. She wanted to know why, at the age of 6, her family was exiled. They loved each other so much, but why didn't he send her a single letter in 14 years? Seeing him crying and clinging to her as if she were his only solace, Ginella felt weak again, like she did when she was 6 years old, but she couldn't stop wondering why Ted's face had changed so much. Was he really the boy she knew from before? Finally, Ginella couldn't help but ask him, Ted, what happened to your appearance? Why did your hair change color, and your eyes too? What happened to you? However, faced with Ginella's overflowing concern, the emperor gently lifted her arm and placed a tender kiss on it, then asked her, why? Ginella didn't like that response. She replied, that's not important, it doesn't look like magic at all. But before she could finish her sentence, the emperor interrupted her, because this is your ideal image. Upon hearing this, Ginella was so surprised she couldn't believe it. She just stood there, then exclaimed, what? She remembered the day she told the emperor that her ideal image was black hair and black eyes. So now, the emperor gently pressed his cheek against the palm of Ginella's hand, his black eyes brimming with tears, both pitiful and moving. He coaxed her, saying that she had said that was her ideal. Hearing him say this, Ginella was still somewhat puzzled, replying, what are you talking about? But before she could finish her sentence, the emperor reached out to embrace her tightly, pulling her close to him, then using his pleasant tone, he called her name, my Ginella. He leaned his face close to hers intimately, telling her, now that I am the emperor, we don't need to be apart anymore. You don't have to endure insults like earlier. And as time passed, the emperor became even more intimate. He gently nibbled on Ginella's ear, using all his patience to declare to her, because everything I have is yours, his possessive madness leaving Ginella stunned, her heart still filled with confusion to the point where she didn't understand what was happening, just feeling very dazed. It felt like she had fallen into a perfect trap. Yet the emperor remained very caring, whispering affectionately near Ginella's ear, expressing, I love you. From now on, we can be together forever, my Ginella, he said with all his love and sincerity. After his words, time seemed to rewind. Ginella remembered that she was often called the child who never cried when she was little. A strange child on the day of her birth, who looked directly into her parents' faces, without crying, to the point where everyone was amazed. In contrast, Ted Bundy was always known as the crying child. A strange child, as if he had been in pain somewhere since birth, always crying whenever he saw people. The emperor began to worry when the prince had no friends, so he arranged a meeting between the strange children. So, the first time the crown prince saw Ginella, who always felt pain and cried, he suddenly felt relieved and said that he didn't hurt anymore, but felt comfortable. It was the crown prince Ted who smiled and said so. And then, Ted became the little tail that always followed Ginella. Although she felt very annoyed because he always found excuses to enter her house, Ginella never hated him, because there were days when the female lead felt so helpless that she collapsed and screamed, "It's useless again." After reading a mountain of books, but still not knowing how to return to the original world, it made her extremely distressed, accompanied by countless other negative thoughts. However, just when she felt utterly helpless, suddenly a warm ray of light shone on her, and that person called her name so warmly, Ginella. The owner of that voice was none other than the crown prince. He even brought flowers, opened the windows of Ginella's dark room, and brightened it up. He always had that innocent and lovely smile on his lips, never hesitating to tell her straight out, "I miss you so much, so I came back today." Seeing her freeze without responding, Ted immediately showed concern and asked her, "What's wrong? Are you in pain?" His warmth was always a sweet comfort to her heart in times like these. So, instead of scolding him, Ginella smiled sweetly, reminding him, "You fool, you have to come in through the main door." This moment was one of those times when she felt comforted by his affection for her, and Ted, still feeling sorry for her, replied, "If Ginella agrees to marry me right away, then I wouldn't have to come back and forth like this." Hearing this somewhat bitter remark, Ginella could only feel distressed, trying to excuse herself by telling him, "You have to be over 20 to get married, Ted." After a bit of awkward reminiscing, now looking at the mature man Emperor Ted in front of her, Ginella felt a bit embarrassed, secretly thinking that at that time, she only thought it was the petulant words of a naive child who didn't know the world. Even if it was true, could a change in appearance be caused by just one word of hers? How could that be possible? While Ginella was still drowning in her tumultuous thoughts, the emperor gently placed a finger on her lips. Then he leaned closer, showing his dissatisfaction, probing, "What's wrong, Ginella? Are you thinking about something else in front of me? That's sad." Ted spoke as if he wanted to probe her, each time getting closer to her lips. His series of smooth actions made Ginella confused. She stood still for a few seconds, just staring at him until their lips were about to touch, then she exclaimed, "Ted, stop," and pushed him away with all her strength. After that, she not only wasn't afraid of being reprimanded by this emperor, but she also directly warned him, "That's enough, Bundy, if you do more, I won't forgive you," she said with a fearless expression. Indeed, Ted didn't punish Ginella either. He just used his cold tone to admonish her, saying, "You're still as stubborn as before, huh?" As for Ginella, she didn't mention that issue anymore, but instead shifted the topic and asked him, "Did you really change your appearance for me?" As soon as she asked this question, Ted immediately restored his indulgent demeanor, saying yes and then smiling sweetly, telling her, "To match your ideal image, I even changed the emperor's attire because you said you liked someone in black." After saying that, Ted continued to press her, asking, "How do you feel? Are you satisfied?" Faced with Ted's somewhat chilling words and actions, Ginella didn't know how to respond correctly. She remained silent, sweating profusely, wondering where everything had started from. Finally, just as she thought about it, Ted continued confidently, saying, "If Ginella wants, I'll change all the decorations to black. Whatever you want." Unexpectedly, even before he could finish his sentence, Ginella quickly spoke up, saying, "Then tell me how you changed your appearance." Indeed, after Ginella made this suggestion, Ted suddenly fell silent, not saying anything more, just standing there quietly, staring at her until she couldn't wait anymore. She had to urge him, "Answer me, Ted, in the face of Janella's urgency. Ted became even more interested, flashing a mocking smile and asking her, curious, huh? If Janella marries me, I'll let you know. After Ted spoke those words so casually, this time it was Janella who froze. She just stood there, looking at Ted smiling in front of her. Intuition had told her from the beginning that although he always acted according to his own wishes, he avoided talking about important matters. By stringing together their entire conversation in her head, Janella also made some predictions that perhaps her family's exile might be related to his change in appearance. She didn't hesitate, decisively turned around, and didn't forget to inform Ted, well then, I'm going home. Saying that, she left amidst his astonishment. Just a few steps after she left, Ted quickly chased after her, coaxing, can I come too? I used to go there often. And I have a gift for you. However, no matter how he tried to bribe her, Janella still kept a cold expression, replying, I don't need gifts. Although she walked fast, she was still just a girl, so Ted not only caught up with her pace, but also surpassed it. He took advantage of the length of his legs, blocking Janella's path, and somehow already had a card in his hand, which he presented to her. Ted told Janella that it was the library entrance card to the Royal Library because he had expanded it. So there would be more magic books than the Conceum, except for the restricted section, she could borrow all the books there. He said it with an air of indifference, as if he knew that Janella's only hobby was reading books. After Ted finished speaking, he naturally reached out and played with a few strands of Janella's hair. Then, with a hint of arrogance, he asked her, don't you like reading books? This presumptuous action seemed to irritate Janella. She angrily turned around to pull her hair back, just about to scold him, but then fell silent when she saw magic emanating from him. After that, Ted stopped, seemingly opening up another space behind him, but still didn't rush to leave. He patiently smiled lovingly at Janella, saying, I'll wait for you at the palace, but you must come early, because my patience is running thin. Ted seemed to be warning Janella before blending into that magic and disappearing. Leaving Janella bewildered, staring blankly, wondering if this was instantaneous teleportation. How could she still stand there like a statue, holding the card Ted gave her, her eyes wide and self-questioning, wondering if he could use even the highest level of magic now? When they met again, the strange things about Ted had passed. The next day, in the Han family castle, a sword fight was taking place, the sound of metal swords clashing echoed throughout the capital. At this moment, Janella and her childhood friend, Ather Bonus, were in an intense duel. However, just as she was fiercely attacking, he suddenly exclaimed, hold on, let's take a break and then continue. Ather seemed a bit exhausted. While Janella was speaking, he was panting, pretending that he was about to collapse. Then, he also resorted to flattering Janella, saying, isn't it too much for you today, Janella? So she lost interest, she sheathed her sword and showed disdain by mocking Ather, you're still as weak as ever, elf? Faced with Janella's mocking smile, Ather didn't hold back either. He found a place to sit down and reproached her, saying, are you the only one who calls the royal knights weak, Janella? She grabbed a nearby water bottle, listened to Ather Bonus's complaints, and said to him, it's because you're a mix of fairy blood, so you're too strong. Just returned to the capital and already enrolled at the Conceum, still sword fighting for days. Ather sighed deeply at this point. After Janella finished drinking the water, she regained her strength, approached him, teasing, so you're too busy with night duties to write me letters, huh? Janella's sudden closeness made him blush slightly, but he still tried to act natural, arguing back, I've said that I've been writing letters continuously, I've always tried to write as many as possible. Even though Elf was embarrassed and tried to explain to Janella, she seemed indifferent to this issue. It was like she was just casually asking. While he was trying to explain, she suddenly called his name, Ather, even after I arrived at Bazin, do you still continue to enter the palace? Janella straightforwardly asked, Ted, before he could answer, she anxiously asked him further, Ted, hasn't he changed something? However, faced with Janella's speculation, Ather pondered for a moment before reluctantly responding, let's see, since ancient times, His Majesty has only walked with you. In my eyes, he still looks like when he was the crown prince. After receiving this answer from Ather, Ginella became even more puzzled. Since that day, she had even asked her father and those around her about Ted, but they all reacted the same way. They didn't know that Ted's appearance had changed. And Ather, after answering Ginella's question, added one more sentence, but it was somewhat chilling. Terrifying. Ginella couldn't hide her curiosity and asked again, and then Ather told her that after the emperor ascended the throne, there had been a storm of bloodshed. After speaking, Ather used a very serious and cautious expression to advise Ginella not to get involved with him if possible. After receiving this advice from Ather, Ginella seemed to fall into contemplation. She realized that indeed, she also had a feeling that she shouldn't get involved. However, after all, she decided to ignore all consequences and went to the royal library by herself. As soon as she stepped in, Ginella resolved herself that she couldn't miss the opportunity to learn more about magic. But she didn't know that all her actions were being observed by the protagonist from a distance. Watching Ginella enter the royal library, Ted whispered to himself, "Finally, you've come, my Ginella. I've been waiting for you for so long." With possessive eyes, as soon as Ginella stepped into the library, she bumped into a group of nobles. One of them, in particular, spoke about the daughter of the Han Marquis. Ginella felt annoyed and thought to herself, indeed, rumors have spread. She also knew that the power of the empire was divided into two factions. One side was the Duke's house, with merit in founding the country, and the other was the Marquis's house, with the Queen's support. As she thought about it, she looked up at the royal family portrait on the wall and remembered that the Queen came from the Marquis's house and was the only woman favored by the former emperor. They had planned to choose the daughter of the Marquis as the crown princess. However, because Ted pursued her, the plan failed, and because of that, her family had been suppressed by surrounding forces, claiming to target the Queen position as soon as she returned to the capital, and rumors about her entering the palace increased. Although uncomfortable, she didn't want to cause any more harm to her family. Thinking of this, she blamed herself even more. Everyone had suffered enough for her in the past 14 years. Remembering the old story, she remembered this. At that time, she was suddenly summoned to the palace by the emperor. Even though he was high up there, the emperor's first words to her were still very polite. "Thank you for coming, Ginella." However, Ginella didn't relax her guard. She quietly realized that the emperor's state looked too strange, and he looked directly at Ginella with a gloomy face, asking, "Do you like black?" He stepped forward with a hateful gaze, pressing Ginella with questions. "Is your ideal model someone with black hair and eyes?" Although Ginella still didn't understand what was happening, she politely replied, "Yes, that's correct, Your Majesty." After hearing Ginella's answer, the emperor seemed to have a hint of resentment in his eyes, squinting and full of blood. However, strangely, after a moment, he crazily smiled coldly. Seeing this, Ginella's mother immediately stepped forward to protect her daughter, regardless of anything, reminding the emperor of his title as the ruler of the Northern Empire. Fairies are a symbol of purity and cleanliness. How can it be considered illegitimate for her daughter to be mixed with elf blood? She affirmed that there was nothing more shameful than this, and if anything happened to the son of the prince, it was also the choice of that child. She urged the emperor not to be angry with her daughter and to protect Ginella in her arms, leaving the emperor standing there helplessly after a few minutes of contemplation. Afterward, the emperor directly ordered Ginella to be taken to Bazan and confined her for life. Ginella's parents were both outraged and strongly opposed this decision, but the emperor didn't listen. After this order was issued, Ginella's entire family remained silent and accepted the punishment without reason. Ginella recalled that scene in a haze, her feet still moving slowly, not knowing when she had reached the door of the library. She entered the royal library and didn't know that someone was secretly observing her every move, that person being Ted. Ginella marveled at the grand scale of the library, and when the library manager heard the noise, he loudly asked who was there. Ginella, unable to contain her surprise at the man's loud question, and the library manager said that only members of the royal family could enter. But as soon as he said that, he fell silent. After a few seconds of confusion, he joyfully exclaimed Janella's name, Janella? However, Janella seemed very calm, even putting her hand to her mouth, to signal him to shush. Then, when the library manager calmed down, the two had a short conversation. Janella jokingly remarked as she followed him, "Your beard still looks the same after 14 years, huh?" And the library manager solemnly told her that the emperor had said, "You will come here, but it's been a long time since I last saw you." Hearing this, Janella was slightly surprised and murmured, "Ted, oh no, His Majesty?" Indeed, very quickly, the library manager replied, "That's right, as soon as he ascended to the throne, His Majesty ordered me to prepare all kinds of books in the field that you were interested in when you were young." Hearing these words from the library manager, Janella was also slightly shocked. Although he had said so, she still had some doubts, telling herself, "So he really hasn't forgotten about me." Meanwhile, the library manager was still enthusiastically introducing and guiding her. "This is the restricted section. If you need any more books, just tell me." "Yes, thank you," Janella smiled and sincerely thanked the manager for his dedication to her. After that, Janella quickly chose a stack of books for herself and threw them onto the table. She first chose a comfortable seat and began flipping through the first few pages of the books to read. But she still couldn't concentrate, as what the library manager had said to her left her very troubled. Janella immersed herself in a pile of thoughts about Ted's changing appearance and the words of the former emperor when he banished her family to Bazan, the fact that he hadn't forgotten about her, but still left her family in Bazan for a year after ascending to the throne. As she thought more, a feeling of anger surged in everything. She reassured herself that it's not that I hate life in Bazan. Although it's a barren place with snow all year round, I've met a great swordsmanship teacher there, so I didn't neglect my swordsmanship training and also escape the restraint and gossip of the noble class. But my family doesn't deserve to be treated like this there. Moreover, it was very difficult to find books related to magic there, so finding a way to return to the original world made Janella quite desperate. Janella silently reminded herself, "Even though I know none of this is his fault, I still can't just ignore what happened." Just as she was thinking this, she didn't know when Ted had approached and sat down next to her, still using his friendly tone to greet her, "Hello, Janella." Seeing the person in front of her made Janella feel somewhat helpless, accompanied by a bit of anger. Without saying a word, she awkwardly muttered "you" and fell silent. Ted, however, continued to display an innocent demeanor as if he didn't know anything, even feigning curiosity with a sound as if waiting for her to continue. Seeing Ted smiling in front of her, Janella felt even more puzzled, wondering, "I deliberately sneaked in here without signing the entry list, how did he know to come here?" Thinking this, she showed cold resentment and asked him, whether in the past or now, "Why are you always restless when you can't stick around with me?" Faced with her uncomfortable attitude, Ted continued to smile indulgently and replied, "Because I like you, Janella." Although this expression didn't sway Janella's heart, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat and abruptly turned away, seeming to have run out of patience, ordering Ted directly, "So tell me, why does no one mention your appearance? Like no one knows you've changed?" As she spoke, she unconsciously placed her hand on Ted's shoulder, a small gesture that directly confused Ted, who exclaimed, "What?" After regaining his composure, he took this opportunity to reach out and hold Janella's hand, expressing interest and asking her, "Is Janella curious about me?" "I'm glad." Ted then proceeded to be even more presumptuous, taking Janella's hand and bringing it to his lips, then not satisfied with this slight touch, he directly extended his tongue to lightly lick Janella's finger. In an even more twisted manner, he murmured, "Sweet, Janella." Hearing these words made Janella's face flush. Just a second later, she angrily grabbed Ted's collar roughly, stopping abruptly, and Janella screamed. In the blink of an eye, Janella, though appearing fragile on the outside, easily pinned Ted onto the table, turning the passive into the active. This unexpected and powerful action of Janella also startled Ted. He just lay there, staring blankly, unable to utter a word, only managing to mutter, "What's this?" Meanwhile, Janella pressed closer, intimidating him, saying, "I've told you, I won't let you off anymore." After saying that, Ginella also fell into contemplation, maintaining her menacing posture, looking down from above at the handsome face below. Ted, on the other hand, still looked serious, as if trying to remember Ginella's face. Time seemed to stand still at that moment, as both of them kept staring at each other, neither speaking, neither wanting to let go, until Ted couldn't hold back anymore, bursting into laughter to break the tense atmosphere. After that, he even unreservedly praised, "Ginella, you're truly strong." Hearing this, Ginella warned sternly, "So don't play tricks anymore." After saying that, Ginella suddenly felt confused, blurting out, "What am I saying to you?" Then she slowly let go, intending to stand up, but at that moment, Ginella suddenly couldn't get up, her hair feeling as if someone was holding it. Indeed, Ted was gently embracing her, pulling her back to lie flat on him, then calmly said to her, "I think it's fine like this." Saying that, he even made an innocent face, a handsome face, that made Ginella's whole body tremble in an instant. She didn't know what to do with this shameless person. However, after a while of trying, she couldn't swallow this anger. She ignored everything, even her own identity, shouting, "I said stop it." This burst of anger turned the library into a battlefield of books, and in her rage, shards scattered everywhere, even the tall figure of Ted was thrown to the ground by Ginella. At this moment, while still groaning in pain, he pretended to arouse Ginella's pity. Seeing that she still had no sympathy whatsoever, Ted turned to anger, blaming her, "It's too much, Ginella. You pushed me without any remorse." Hearing him say these words, Ginella became even more cold and arrogant, tossing her hair aside, arrogantly replying, "You should be grateful, because I didn't really hit you." Seeing her strong attitude, Ted couldn't help but tease, asking her, "I heard you met a great swordsmanship teacher in Bazan?" After saying that, without waiting for Ginella's answer, Ted sighed to himself, "You've grown stronger since you were little." Hearing these words from him, Ginella suddenly felt a bit sorry for herself, "So he also knows that I had a teacher." The more she thought about it, the more confused she became, looking at the handsome man in front of her with countless worries. Something had changed, not just in appearance, but something else had changed too. She felt extremely confused, wondering what it was. Despite feeling strangely uneasy, she couldn't help but be drawn by her attention. Thinking this, she raised her hand as if being mesmerized by Ted, unable to resist, not staring at him forever until after a while, she realized her actions were a bit foolish. So she quickly turned her head, avoiding his gaze. Still feeling a bit confused, she wondered, is it because his appearance fits my taste that I'm like this? Meanwhile, Ted, seeing her blush, turned away to hide, feeling even more delighted, laughing loudly to tease her, "Ginella, you really like black, don't you?" After that, he blushed himself, awkwardly continuing, "I'm glad to be able to attract your attention, even if it comes at a price." Just as everything seemed calm, Ginella suddenly heard the words "at a price" in her heart, instantly becoming alert. Then she seemed to lose all patience, relentlessly pressing Ted, demanding, "So how did you change your hair and eye color? Why didn't anyone notice your change? Don't dodge this time, answer me." Ginella questioned Ted with an extremely serious and firm attitude, as if he didn't answer, she wouldn't let it go. Ted, after a period of silent contemplation, his eyes also showed a hint of weariness. However, he didn't hide anymore, directly letting Ginella know, "I'm connected to the royal court, what's there to hide?" Ginella unconsciously exclaimed, seemingly extremely surprised by this reason. She had thought of all kinds of possibilities, but had never thought something like this would happen. Ted, still using a calm tone, explained to her, "The first emperor unified the northern continent and established the empire, but to restrain neighboring countries and prevent war with the southern empire, as well as to stop the factional fighting with the nobles, he synchronized himself with the royal court to monitor anyone in the castle. Since then, the oath has been passed down to successive emperors inheriting that power." After explaining these mysteries, Ted seemed afraid that Ginella wouldn't understand, so he patiently continued, "In short, this place is my territory." Hearing him speak so much, Ginella didn't know how to respond. She could only use a bitter tone to tell him, "I really don't know." Ted didn't blame her at all, but rather was very understanding, saying it was a secret only passed down to the heir. Furthermore, he belonged to a type with stronger energy than previous emperors. Then he continued to explain that if someone had been to the castle once, he could manipulate their memories. Ted spoke in an extremely indifferent tone, as if this was as simple as killing a mosquito. The more Ginella heard, the more confused she became. She felt a slight headache and had to put her hand on her forehead, silently sighing. Indeed, it's so isolated. Looking at the seemingly unfamiliar person in front of her, Ginella became extremely anxious and confused since hearing his words, worrying and feeling extremely puzzled. Only speculating to herself, but no matter how strong the magic of the first emperor was, passing on power through generations, even after death, isn't normal, unless there's some strong intervention, right? Thinking this, Ginella became even more determined. Indeed, she had to study more about this magic. But just as she thought about it, she suddenly remembered that something wasn't right, exclaiming to Ted, "Wait a minute? My memories are still normal very quickly." Ted explained to her that it was because she was a hybrid of a fairy. Then he began to explain that the offspring of beings of light like fairies or elves were opposed to the power of the royal family. Hearing him say this, Ginella became even more curious, asking him, "Aren't you worried?" "Worried about what?" Ted, even more calmly, asked back, "What's that?" Ginella felt even more pleased, putting her hand on Ted's chest, using a tone on her face, she asked him, then looked intently at Ted's innocent handsome face. It seemed like he was always ready to cry, just waiting for her to come so he could shed tears. Looking at him like that, Ginella felt even sadder. But she couldn't suppress her resentment. After all these years, she tried to keep a cold face, silently thinking, "I want to annoy him. If I don't retaliate, even just a little like this, I'll feel really unjust for being ignored for the past 14 years. Unexpectedly, just seconds after she had resolved her determination, she immediately heard a very calm sentence from Ted. He gently said to her, as if it were obvious, "Ginella, you can't do that to me." Then, very naturally, he reached out, gently holding her hand, and only then did he continue to explain, "Because you're the only one who's always stood by me. And I only have you." Ted spoke and then continued to take Ginella's hand and place it on his right cheek, transmitting to her the purest touch of flesh. This series of actions and warm words made Ginella very emotional for a moment. She felt very confused, letting Ted do whatever he wanted. But only for a few seconds, Ginella realized and quickly escaped from those emotions. She decisively pulled her hand away from Ted, feeling even more resentful. Silently thinking, "Yes, I've always stood by you, but I won't show any reverence anymore." She directly asked Ted with annoyance, "Do you think that when I see you change like this, I can act like nothing happened?" After finishing speaking, Ginella didn't wait for his answer anymore, but angrily turned away and said, "That's it for today, I'm leaving." Her cold demeanor made Ted extremely frightened. He hurriedly wanted to keep her but didn't dare to touch Ginella openly anymore, only trying to persuade her with words. "Wait, I was wrong, Ginella, please don't leave." But no matter what he said, Ginella still left decisively. When she reached the door, Ted quickly resorted to threatening tactics. "If you leave like this, I'll execute Lily Sunny." However, Ginella responded with apparent indifference, seeming to have run out of patience with Ted's repeated attempts to intimidate her. But as she hadn't stepped out yet, Ted changed from threats to remorse. He weakly asked from behind, "Do you also hate it when I change?" The tone and words were exactly the same as when they were young, when Ted forced Ginella not to look away. However, at this moment, she tried to force herself to remain indifferent to him. Then, she decisively walked away, trying to appear cold to leave Ted with a sarcastic farewell, "Until next time, Your Highness." After saying that, she left and closed the library door behind her. She leaned against the door and tried to keep herself from softening as Ted was still behind the door, calling Ginella's name with all his might. Everything seemed too heavy and sudden for her. Even though she wanted to say something to him at this moment, she could only silently think. "It's not that I hate your change, but now I need time to sort out my thoughts," Ginella told Ted. She was determined to speak as calmly as possible to the person behind the door. It's better for us to keep our distance for a while. Jeanella didn't wait for a response from Ted, just left him pitifully behind the door. Hearing her footsteps fading away, Ted didn't know what to do other than let the tears fall. His mouth continued to call Janella's name. Though Jeanella appeared indifferent, her feelings weren't much better than Ted's. She had forced herself to run away from him so her heart wouldn't waver anymore. But even though she ran far away, in her head, she couldn't stop hearing his question from earlier. Do you also hate it when I change? Jeanella felt extremely torn. She couldn't understand what the word also in that question meant. The only thing she could guess was if someone else had hurt him. When she remembered Ted's words, Jeanella became even more confused and puzzled. She felt deeply distressed and asked herself, am I really the only one who's always stood by him? Thinking of that moment, she remembered the image of the blonde boy who cried a little every day when he saw her. He would run happily to her like a puppy, calling her name Jeanella. Then, he would grab her hand and beg, let's go together, as Ted said to her. She didn't feel embarrassed, but exposed, saying, it's because you keep insisting on having the stewardess accompany us. Although outwardly, she appears cold towards him. But she herself understands that this is indeed a good opportunity to participate in the class of Grand Mage Connor. Ted always appears innocent at that time, always taking the opportunity to lean on Janella's shoulder and flatter her. If she likes it, then he likes it too. Although his appearance seems uncomfortable with magic, Jeanella always thinks that he trusts her as much as she trusts him. So even though she doesn't like the feeling of being touched, she always compromises to let Ted do what he wants. Janella's memories become clearer day by day. She remembers that 14 years ago, on the first day she met the Grand Mage, the first words Jeanella said as a child were, hello Grand Mage, I am Jeanella of the Han family. Although it was a bit sudden, she was still very happy to meet him.